Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canelli, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. He's a registered private investigator, an author who has written 10 true crime books about subjects such as Jimmy Hoffa, JFK, Ronald Reagan, O.J. Simpson, which was a national bestseller. He served as the president of the Washington Independent Writers and the national vice president of the National Writers Union, in which he is a founding member. He's the godfather, in my opinion, of the disappearance and the research of Jimmy Hoffa, an independent journalist who specializes in organized crime investigations and political corruptions. He's known as one of the most fearless and relentless reporters in America with a solid, honest reputation. Please welcome to the show, Dan Moldea. Dan, welcome to Before the Lights.
Tommy, pleasure. Thank you for the kind words. Much appreciated.
You have well deserved them. Let me start here before we get into some of the deep stuff with Hoffa and the things that you've covered. Where has your thirst come for reporting and writing?
Oh, geez. I guess I've always been a busybody. I don't know. I was a civil rights worker. I had a good record back in college and in graduate school. College at the University of Akron, graduate school at Kent State University. I worked as assistant director of a federal poverty agency, and while I was there, I discovered that our executive director had been embezzling money from the agency. And so he fired me when I confronted him with the evidence. And so I walked across the street to the prosecutor's office. And suddenly there were problems in that the gentleman who, my boss, had a bar on the side. It was during the 1974 recession, and he got into debt. He couldn't pay his debt back, so he borrowed some money off an alleged mafia loan shark there in the Portage County area. And so, who was supposedly connected to the mafia. And, you know, I was pretty naive back then. I thought Elliot Ness and the Untouchables had cleaned up the mob back in the 30s. I didn't even think they existed. And so I needed a job. And so a gentleman by the name of Mr. Bill Ellis, he owned a little newspaper in Akron, Ohio, my hometown. And it was called The Reporter. It came out weekly. And Mr. Ellis was he was an attorney who was a junior attorney with the NAACP in the Brown v. Board of Education case. And I really, really looked up to Mr. Ellis. He was one hell of a guy. And he needed a token white columnist to write for his newspaper, so he picked me. And so I was writing about pretty lightweight stuff at the beginning. You know, Harlem Globetrotters came to town. The Olympic boxing team came to town. The Ohio Ballet, a hockey game that went into triple overtime. And then I was introduced to a gentleman by the name of Mac McKinley. Mac McKinley was a rank and file reform leader in the Teamsters Union. He was associated with a group called the Teamsters United Rank and File, TURF, TURF. And Mac wanted to educate me about the Teamsters. They were looking for somebody to write about it. And so he started giving me information. And he gave me this ledger book. I met him at 3 o'clock at 3:15 in the morning, that cold wintry day in Akron on a street corner in downtown. And he passed me the black ledger book of Teamsters loans, with many of which had gone to Vegas, trucking companies, mob-owned companies, real estate ventures, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started doing an 8-part series, the Teamsters, the Mafia, and their pension fund. The Teamsters, the Mafia, and their pension fund. And I got a little bit of attention for it. It was an 8-part series. It ran from sometime in January to sometime in March of 1975. And so I caught the attention of a reporter named John Quitney from the Wall Street Journal. And so John said, listen, I just saw your 8-part series in that little newspaper down there. And I was wondering, I'm thinking about doing a 3-part series myself for the Journal. I was wondering if you could help me out a little bit. And, so basically I was a free researcher for him, but I was happy to do it. I was proud to be associated with John. His reputation had preceded him. I had read The Fountain Pen Conspiracy, which was one of his big books, and I was always very impressed with John's work. And so I was honored to be doing work for this guy, even gratis. And so John's series came out on July 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, 1975. And while the news about what John had brought up percolated, he was very kind and credited me around, telling me people that I was the guy to see. And 1 week later, Jimmy Hoffa disappears on July 30th, 1975, 1 week after John's 3-part series comes out. So John and I came up with, John called me up and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I don't know. What do you think?" He says, "What do you think?" And I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think he's alive." And he goes, "I think he's alive too." So we came to this harebrained theory that Hoffa was alive and well and at the Jack-O-Lantern Inn in Eagle River, Wisconsin. So we met in Chicago. We flew into Chicago. The Journal picked up my expenses. And we met in Chicago, flew together to Rhinelander, Wisconsin, rented a car, and drove up to Eagle River, which is where the Jack-O-Lantern Inn was located. It was a mob lodge in the northern woods, and it was a pretty spectacular place. I went in, I got bit by a dog and everything else. I got taken at gunpoint in. John wrote the introduction to the Hoffa Wars paperback edition, and he told this whole story. And anyway, long story short, John went back to New York to take all the grief he was going to take from the guys on his staff at the Journal. Meantime, I had a ticket anywhere I wanted to go, so I went to Detroit, which is where Hoffa was last seen. I had $2 cash and a credit card in my pocket. I was only 25 at the time. And so I hitchhiked up to the Red Fox restaurant where Hoffa was last seen. I walked in. I knew something had to happen very fast. And I saw the distinguished, legendary journalist Irving R. Levine from NBC News walk by. He was the gentleman he was the bald guy with the bow tie, very distinguished guy. He was our chief labor and economics reporter. And he went down to a phone bank downstairs to the right of the entrance. So I followed him downstairs, and I was waiting for him to finish whatever he was doing. And he had the phone in his hand, and he looks at me and he says, "Can I help you?" And I said, "You need me." And he says, "What?" I said, "You need me." He says, "I need you for what?" I said, "You need me for the Hoffa case." So he puts the phone down. He says, "You know something about the case?" And I said, "I worked with John Quitney on his 3-part series last week." And he says, "Are you that graduate student from Kent State?" And I said, "Yeah, that's me." And he says, "What are you doing for lunch?" And I said, "No plans." And he said, "Come on up and join us." So I went up there. There was the whole crew up there. Bob Toombs was their field producer, who was basically running the show. And they said, "Okay, we're going to do some interviews this afternoon. Why don't you come along?" They gave me a trivia test about Hoffa and stuff to make sure I knew something about him, which of course I did. And so we interviewed Lenny Schultz, who was one of the 3 people Hoffa was supposed to meet. We interviewed Joe Bain from Local 614 in Pontiac, Michigan. And we went back to the Southfield Sheraton, the hotel, and where my fate would be decided. And they were passing out room keys to the crew. And so I was standing there by myself, and I saw Toombs and Irving talking and looking over at me, smiling. And I said, and Bob Toombs comes over. Both of them came over actually, and Bob Toombs puts his hand on my shoulder, and he says, "Welcome aboard, kid. Don't fuck up." And so that was. So the next day I was working with. I was like helping to run the Hoffa investigation for NBC News, and I got a contact from. I got a source in the rank and file reform movement who started feeding me information about a guy named Rolland McMaster.
Oh. And
Rolland McMaster became my nemesis for the next 3-4 years. And Rolland was one of the strongest arms behind Hoffa from the beginning during his rise, and he became one of his fiercest enemies during what became Hoffa's fall. I believed and presented evidence to the FBI that McMaster was and his goon squad that he operated were behind a series of acts of violence in Teamsters Local 299 against pro-Hoffa people, and beatings, bombing, shooting, sabotage, and that McMaster had some role in the disposal of Hoffa's body. And so I went with that. I met Jimmy Hoffa Jr. through Steve Riddle, who was Jimmy Hoffa Sr.'s uncle, and he introduced me to his nephew, or to Jimmy Jr. And Jimmy Jr. Said, "Steve says you know something. What do you know?" And I told him, and he immediately called the FBI. And two agents who actually had visited me about 2-3 weeks earlier in Ohio came to his office. One of whom was one of the FBI agents who came to my home in Ohio, 2-3 weeks earlier. And so Jimmy Jr. said, "Tell these guys what you just told me." And I gave them the tap dance on the 299 violence in Hoffa's Local before he disappeared. And Jimmy turns to the FBI guys and says, "What do you think?" And they said, "We know about this guy. We know of his work, and we think this is legitimate. We think he's on an interesting path here. We believe that he's absolutely on target on the violence in Local 299. We believe he's figured that out. With regard to the Hoffa case, we're still up in the air about that. We can't really make any conclusions right now. But I think what he has to say has merit." So they leave, and Jimmy offered me $2,100 from the Teamsters Reward Fund, the Hoffa Reward Fund, which was a fund of money, a reservoir of money that had been contributed by different locals around the country, individuals, people who are interested in seeing Hoffa found. And we're talking, Hoffa still has only been missing for a few days at this point. I was there at the beginning. I was there day one on the Hoffa thing. I started investigating Hoffa and the Teamsters 8 months before Hoffa disappeared. And I was on the case from day one when John called me, and we did our wild goose chase up in Eagle River, Wisconsin. And then I was with NBC News, and then I was with them for about a month. The case was going cold, and so they offered me a job, and I said, I'm going to stay on this Hoffa case. I think I'm on to something here. So I went back into freelance land, and then I talked to some FBI guys, and they said, come to Detroit. And so Jimmy Hoffa Jr., along with giving me the money from the reward fund, he also introduced me to the labor editor at the Detroit Free Press, Ralph Orr, who got me an assignment to work on Rolland McMaster and his goon squad. And that was the beginning of a 48 year obsession. This has been going on for a long, long time. I feel like Ahab in the Hoffa case is my white whale.
I agree.
And so I came out with my book, The Hoffa Wars, in 1978. And then I sort of burned out after that. It was a very difficult period of time. Book did fine. Book of the Month Club collection. New York Times did a big story on me that I considered to be my literary birth certificate. And I was just an unknown freelance writer from Akron, Ohio. And then the New York Times chief book critic, Herb McGang, God bless her, wrote this spectacular piece, which, once again, I view as my literary birth certificate. I was born as an author on June 29th, 1978. That's when the story was published.
Let me ask you this. Let me go back before the disappearance. And I've done a lot of shows with different people for organized crime, and some of my listeners are caught up to speed and some aren't. But I wanted to go here with you first, and then I want to talk more about the disappearance. But can you tell my listeners how much involvement Hoffa had into the murder of JFK, as you were the first to present the case in your Hoffa Wars book?
Well, what had happened was I had gotten a grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. And the executive director of the fund and the president of the fund were both friends of mine. And people I had met through the investigative journalism business here in Washington. And they suggested that I meet a guy named Mike Ewing. And Mike Ewing is legendary researcher here in Washington. And so Mike and I became acquainted. We decided to work together. I wanted to pay Mike, of course. And so I went back to the fund. They gave me an additional grant, all of which I gave to Mike. And so Mike and I started investigating Hoffa, the possible role of Jimmy Hoffa, the Carlos Marcello, the boss of the New Orleans Mafia, and Santo Trafficani, the boss of the Tampa Mafia. And so we came up with a considerable amount of evidence indicating that this was a possibility. So when Mike finished his assignment with me, he then moved on to join the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was just gearing up for a big investigation and a set of hearings. And the chief counsel of the committee was a guy named Bob Blakey, who was probably the world's expert on the mafia. He was the prosecutor in the Department of Justice in 1970 who wrote the RICO legislation. He was a law professor at Notre Dame. He is a legend in the world of organized crime investigations. And so when the report came out, which Mike and another friend of mine, Dick Billings, formerly of Life magazine, very fine writer, wrote. They wrote, from what I understand, they made the major contributions to the final report. The House Select Committee had concluded that Hoffa, Marcello, and Trafficani, this is a year after my book came out where I made this claim, that Hoffa, Marcello, and Trafficani had motive, means, and opportunity to have the president killed. And then Bob Blakey, the world's expert on the mafia, came out on his own during a press conference and said, the mob did it. It's a historical fact. And what I believe, what I believed and what Mike believed, what we believed together was that Hoffa was working with some mafia guys who were involved in the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. We believe that everything sprang out of there, where the mafia was able to compromise the Central Intelligence Agency because of their work together in their stupid, ridiculous efforts to kill Fidel Castro. When Bobby Kennedy found out about these plots, he was absolutely furious, and he went to the CIA and he says, I assume that you people understand that you are doing business with people that the Kennedy Justice Department is trying to put in jail. And so we believe that the plot against JFK evolved from the plots against Castro, and that I don't know much about the crime scene at the JFK murder there in Dealey Plaza. I've never investigated with regard to who fired the shots. I don't know.
Right.
I'm willing to accept that Oswald did it and did it alone, because if you look at Oswald's background, there's a mob guy there, a guy who helped raise him, a guy like Charlie Detz-Murat. And in New Orleans, he was associated with Carlos Marcello. If you look at Jack Ruby, mafia everywhere on this guy, hanging all over this guy.
Yes.
Jimmy Hoffa's son, Jimmy Hoffa Jr., told me that his dad knew Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby's brother, Earl Ruby, was a friend of the local 299 crowd there in Detroit. He owned Cobo Cleaners. It was the ties to the mob in the JFK case are out of this world. Now Alan Dulles, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, sat on the Warren Commission, which was the first investigation of the murder. And Alan Dulles is fully aware of the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. And I just find it hard to believe, Tommy, that if Dulles had just said at one of their meetings, hey guys, I should probably tell you that while I was director of the CIA, we were working with the mafia to kill Castro. I can't believe that would have created a whole new avenue in the investigation for the Warren Commission.
I agree.
And so when people make fun of people who believe, that something else was going on at that murder, but let's face it, there was a cover up from the get-go. Once again, Alan Dulles kept his mouth shut, and it was basically a cover-up where the CIA was trying to cover up its relationship with the mafia during the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro. And the law enforcement community, I think, was compromised as a result of that relationship. And I think that was one of the biggest black marks against our intelligence agencies ever in American history, working with the mafia to kill a foreign leader. And so that's what I believe happened, and I still believe that to this day. I'm waiting to see. All these documents are coming out. I don't know if the key documents are I think the key documents are summaries of what people believe, people in the know believe, people who are collecting evidence, the analysts coming out of the archives and things like that. I don't know if that's ever going to come out, but I believe that Hoffa, Marcello, Trafficani arranged and executed the murder of President Kennedy in 1963. And I stand by that.
Dan, when Frank Fitsimmons took over the Teamsters and basically became the mob's go-to guy, who was much easier to work with as he was more of a yes man than Jimmy Hoffa, was that the demise then of Hoffa?
Well, what happened was when Hoffa went to jail in 1967, as you say, he appointed his handpicked successor, who he gave the title Executive Vice President, was Frank Fitsimmons. And Frank Fitsimmons was Hoffa's caretaker for the International Union. Hoffa's caretaker in Local 299 was a guy named Dave Johnson. And so while Hoffa was in jail, Rolland McMaster, the guy I was on, the guy I said was behind the Local 299 violence before Hoffa disappeared, bombings, beatings, shootings, sabotage, that Rolland McMaster was making an effort to take over Local 299. And it was as a result of that dispute that McMaster and Hoffa had a huge falling out, massive. It was game ending between them. And Frank Fitsimmons supported McMaster, which caused the falling out between Hoffa and Fitsimmons. And then in July of 1971, Frank Fitsimmons at the International Convention, Frank Fitsimmons was elected in his own right as president of the Teamsters Union. So when Hoffa was released as a result of a commutation from President Nixon in December of 1971, because Nixon was trying to curry favor with at least one union before the 1972 presidential election, where he would be seeking re-election, Hoffa was given this commutation of his 13-year prison sentence with the proviso that he not seek union office until 1980, when he would be 70 years old, something like that. And Hoffa, he just wanted to get out of jail, and so he got out of jail as fast as he could, and then he started fighting the restrictions on his commutation. Mm-hmm. He wanted to take over the union again. And in the Teamsters Union, it's not like the UAW or the United Mine Workers Union, where you have one man vote, one vote. Back then, it is now, but back then it was not. And basically, it was the officers of the various unions who were delegates to the Teamsters Convention, which was held every 5 years. And it was from that group of delegates where the General Executive Board, including the vice presidents and the president of the union, would be selected. So in order to be a candidate at the General Teamsters Convention every 5 years, you had to be a delegate. And in order to be a delegate, you had to be an officer of a local. In order to be an officer of a local, you had to legally be able to run, which Hoffa was not. Hoffa tried legal maneuvers and everything else. He could not get out. Hoffa was a centralist. He tried to centralize power in his own hands. Fitsimmons was a decentralist. He was delegating power down to the various vice presidents of the Teamsters Union. And so these various vice presidents who had like Zippo power under Hoffa were able to create their own fiefdoms in their own jurisdictions, working with whatever mob guys or with whomever they wanted, and would make a lot of money in the process. And the mob guys were happy because they didn't have to deal with the centralized government that Hoffa was running. So Hoffa believed that he was being double-crossed by mafia guys who he had helped make rich through the abuse of the union's health and welfare and pension funds, and through the general fund, and through general, misdeeds and bad behavior, that Hoffa decided to seek revenge. And so Hoffa started talking. He was talking to congressional committees. He was talking to grand juries. He was talking to reporters. And in the end, I believe that's why Hoffa had to be silenced, because he was seeking revenge and he was talking.
Mm-hmm.
The way to look at the Hoffa murder, just to be clear, is that it's a 3-act drama with different characters in each act. In Act 1, Hoffa goes to the Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, just north of Detroit, and he's expecting a meeting with 2 mafia guys, Tony Provenzano of New Jersey and Tony Giacalone of Detroit, who were somehow related by marriage. The third person was a guy named Lenny Schultz, who was a Detroit businessman who was associated with Tony Giacalone. According to the FBI, none of these guys show up. Giacalone, Provenzano, Schultz, none of them shows up. In Act 2, Hoffa is picked up and he's taken someplace. He's taken someplace where he is murdered. And then in Act 3, his body is disposed of. Now, very quickly, there were a ton of theories as to, A, who killed Hoffa, and even more theories times 4, times 10, about what happened to Hoffa's body. And so an informant stepped forward, a guy named Ralph Picardo. Ralph Picardo was associated with the Provenzano crowd, and he was in Trenton State Penitentiary doing 20 years for manslaughter. And he got a visit about a week after Hoffa disappeared from a guy named Steve Andretta, who just died last month. And Steve Andretta was one of the alleged 4 co-conspirators in the Hoffa murder case, and unknown to everybody at that time. And during his prison visitation with Ralph Picardo, he told him a story, saying that Hoffa had been murdered in Detroit, that he had been stuffed into a 55-gallon drum. He had been loaded onto a Gateway transportation truck and shipped to New Jersey. So a few months go by, and Ralph Picardo's sitting there in jail, and he's going, geez, I've got this ace rock information here, and I'm sitting in jail, rotting away. I think it's time that I make a beeline to the nearest federal prosecutor. And so he goes to the FBI, and he tells them what Steve Andretta had told him. Murdered in Detroit, stuffed into a 55-gallon drum, loaded onto a Gateway transportation truck, shipped to New Jersey. So they say, well, who killed Hoffa? And he says, well, Steve didn't tell me that, but I know as a fact that Salvador Briguglio had a contract from Tony Provenzano to kill Hoffa in 1973-74. He says, I remember that because I was part of the crew at that time. And he says, did he say where, when they took him to Jersey, did he say where they buried him? And Picardo says, no, but I know once again from being around these guys that there was a place called Brother Moscato's Dump. Mm-hmm. It was a toxic waste site under the Pulaski Skyway in Jersey City, and that's where bodies would be buried. And so the FBI got a search warrant, and on December, I think it was December 11th, December 12th, right around mid-December, they went with a search warrant to Moscato's Dump. They dropped the search warrant up on Brother Moscato and his partner, Paul Coppola. Brother Moscato was a soldier in the Vito Genovese crime family. Paul Coppola was certainly connected, but he was not a made guy. The FBI, it was a big, huge toxic waste dump that was filled with wild dogs, rats, quicksand. It was, hell on earth over there. And the FBI didn't have a specific place to look in this anywhere from 34 to 53 acre, nightmare. And so it was dropped, and the theory was basically dropped. So then fast forward 2007, a friend of mine and I are investigating a crooked judge down in Florida, and he's supposedly getting payoffs from mafia guys. So I'm reading these documents and talking to sources, and it turns out the mafia guy who's paying off the judge is Phil Moscato of Brother Moscato's Dump. So I pick up the phone, I call Moscato, and I said, excuse me, I'm investigating Judge so-and-so, and, I'm seeing you're associated with them, and with respect, can I come up and interview you? And he goes, yeah, sure, come on. So I go up and see this Vito Genovese crime family soldier, Phil Moscato, and he is very nice. He talks very openly about his relationship with the judge. He admits that he gave him money. And I said, the first time I heard about you was during the Hoffa case. And he said, yeah. He says, you wrote that book, right? The Hoffa Wars, right? And I said, yeah. I said, so tell me what happened. He says, well, I was at the grand jury. After Ralph Picardo flipped and turned state's evidence, the federal prosecutors in Detroit had a grand jury hearing where they presented evidence. And during this, based on what Picardo had told them, they brought in Steve Andretta and his brother Tommy Andretta, and they brought in Sal Bergoglio, who Steve alleged had murdered Hoffa, and his brother Gabe Bergoglio. And the fifth person they brought in was Rolland McMaster, my guy. So I was very excited at this point. So then I later I'm the only person living or dead, only journalist living or dead who's interviewed the Bergoglio brothers and the Andretta brothers. And I had Steve Andretta and Sal Bergoglio 3.5 hours on tape while they were there with Provenzano's brother, who was the president of Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey, as well as Bill Buffalino, who was the attorney for the Bergoglios and the Andrettas. And so I really got into Steve Andretta's face about his alleged meeting with Picardo a week after the murder, and I also got into Bergoglio's face with regard to the allegation that he was Hoffa's actual killer. I don't want to sound too macho here or anything like that, but I was very aggressive because I knew I had a moment here with these guys, and they were very pleasant with me. I mean, for what it's worth, they were very pleasant with me. But I was very aggressive because I had what I thought was a moment in history here. They didn't admit anything to me. It's all on tape. I've given the tape to the FBI. They have the whole 3.5 hours. Because all they ever got out of these guys was the fifth. Anyway, Moscato, he was giving me information. I stayed in touch with Moscato for 7 years, between 2007 and 2014, during which time, for the most part, he was giving me information with the frequency that a kosher butcher sells pork chops. But he was telling me things at the same time. He told me that in Act 1, Hoffa was picked up by Vito Giacalone, the brother of Tony Giacalone, who was a mafia guy. He told me that in Act 2, yes, in fact, it was Sal Bergoglio who killed Hoffa. Moscato told me Picardo basically had it right. And in Act 3, he said Hoffa's buried at my dump. So, and I got all this on tape.
Hang on, Dan. So I want to kind of go something there because I'm sure some listeners have seen The Irishman and they may believe the movie, as some people do, and think that Frank Sheeran actually killed Jimmy Hoffa. And that's not the case, is it?
No, Moscato made it clear that Frank Sheeran had no role in this thing at all.
Okay.
Moscato told me flat, Frank Sheeran was a guy who was not respected. He was not part of this whole thing. There was an earlier book. I'm sorry to digress from the road I was on this thing because I'm going somewhere with this.
Yeah, sorry.
But just to divert this thing with Sheeran, Sheeran is a liar. He was a pathological liar. And don't take anything that Sheeran says seriously. I here in Washington, I've hosted a dinner for authors for the past 30-some years at the Old Europe restaurant over in the Glover Park section of town. And I had one night we had about 80 authors, and who should show up? Robert De Niro. And Robert De Niro wanted to come and meet the authors, but he also wanted to see me. And because he wanted to talk to me because he and Scorsese were thinking about doing The Irishman and everything else. And once again, this is one of those moments where it's a moment in history. I don't have a lot of time. If I had more time, I would have taken it. So when De Niro and I and a third guy, Gus Rousseau, who brought De Niro to the dinner, spun off from the group and went over at the corner table and talked, I was very frank with De Niro, telling him, you are getting conned by this Frank Sheeran story. You have fallen in love with this perpetrator who was lying. He had died in December of 2003, I think. And he, so De Niro had never met him or anything like that. All he had was what the guy who wrote the book, Charlie Brand, who's a very nice guy, very respected guy, and everything else. I thought it was an excellent book. It's just it was not true. Mm. And I told De Niro, our conversation was heated. And like I said, I wanted to get along with this guy because, why not? What mob reporter would not want to get along with Robert De Niro, for heaven's sakes? And, but I told him he just basically didn't know what the hell he was talking about. And he took offense to it, and as you might expect. And we did not part as friends. And so when the Irishman came out, there was this dispute. And to his credit, De Niro said some very nice things about me when asked for comment about all of this. Once again, it did become an issue. But I insist, that the evidence is so clear on this that Sheeran is lying, and I'm not the expert on this thing. Jack Goldsmith had written pieces for the New York Times, for Lawfare, for I think the New York Review of Books. I mean, he had written a book. He was the stepson of Chucky O'Brien, the quote unquote foster son of Jimmy Hoffa, who many people believe for many years was the person who had picked up Hoffa at the Red Fox. Anyway, can I get back to this other thing? Because Moscato tells me, hey, the body's at my dump. So I really don't know where to go with this. And to make a long story short, in February of 2019, I was on a TV show, on Fox News, in fact. And Fox News had really supercharged the Frank Sheeran story. They had been really behind it, promoting it, everything else. And there was another reporter on, a very fine reporter named Ed Barnes, and the host was Eric Shawn. And I had known Eric for a long time. I'd known Ed as well. And but they were big supporters of Frank Sheeran and his story. They had been supercharging the Frank Sheeran story since the book I Heard You Paid Houses came out in 2004. And so we went on the show in anticipation of The Irishman coming out later in 2019, and they were doing their Frank Sheeran thing. And I said, guys, I interviewed Phil Moscato. I did a story about it on the 40th anniversary of Hoffa's murder on July 30th, 2015. And I told the whole story of what Phil Moscato told me, that Hoffa, that Picardo basically had it right, that Sal Bergoglio was the killer, and that Hoffa's body was at this dump in Jersey City. So watching all of this on TV down in Florida is a guy named Paul Coppola Jr. Paul Coppola Jr. is the youngest son of Paul Coppola Sr., who is Brother Moscato, the late Brother Moscato's partner at Brother Moscato's dump in Jersey City, New Jersey. And he says, listen, I just saw you on TV talking about Brother Moscato and the dump. My dad was the partner with Moscato, and I think my brother knows something about this. Mm. And so I said, can you introduce me to your brother? Well, it took between February, finally in September of 2019, I finally was able to get an interview with Frank Coppola, the oldest son of Paul Coppola, Brother Moscato's partner at the Brother Moscato's dump, which was also known as the PJP Landfill. And Frank Coppola told me that Hoffa's body was at the dump and he knew where it was. So I had about 7 interviews with him over the phone where he never changed as much as a detail of what was going on. And then I said, let's meet. So I paid for him to come to fly to New Jersey, and where he was staying with his girlfriend. And then I met him. We had dinner on Saturday night, September 28th, 2019. And he said, I'm thinking about going to the dump tomorrow. I haven't been there a long time. And I said, motherfucker, you were taking me with you. And he started laughing. He says, you want to go? And I said, hey, that's why I'm here, man. We're going. So the next morning, he picks me up, Sunday morning, September 29th. picks me up at my hotel. We drive to Jersey City, go to this area, which is kind of a spooky area. And we drive into this series of alcoves under the Pulaski Skyway, which is not at the dump, but close to the dump, maybe 100, 150 yards away from the dump. And so he's giving me a tour of the area. And what had happened, according to Frank, was, and again, I've got this on film. I had a body camera on and I had a camera on in my hand and memorializing everything. And he tells me that his dad was told by Brother Moscato, even before Hoffa was announced that Hoffa was missing, that Hoffa was going to be delivered at the site. That Moscato said, "I can't be here tonight. You're going to have to take care of this." So Paul Coppola was horrified by this, to be given this assignment, which links him to a criminal conspiracy. So in retaliation for Moscato's, let's say, arrogance, instead of burying him, Hoffa, where Moscato told him to bury him at the dump, Paul Coppola took the body off-site to this alcove under the Pulaski Skyway, which had the only connection to the dump was that's where the sort of the entrance to this alcove area was, and to the dump itself, or one of the entrances. And so Moscato and Coppola had their office there, which was a trailer. So Coppola gets a excavator and he digs a big hole. Hoffa's in a 55-gallon drum, puts him at the bottom of the 55-gallon drum. Then he gets a front loader and puts 15 to 30 drums on top of Hoffa, and then bulldozes the whole thing tight. So, Frank, we're walking around, and he says, "Here's where Hoffa is." And he shows me the alcove where Hoffa is. It's about the size of a Little League baseball field. He doesn't give me the exact spot, like right here. Here it is right here. But it's in this alcove, not a very big space, but it's, manageable. And so I start trying to putting a team together. We say, a guy named Bo Carson was my team captain. He's associated with the film industry in Hollywood, and we got a showrunner, Ari Mark from Ample Entertainment, award-winning producer, documentarian, but we all agreed that we would not accept any money for any of this until A, the body was recovered, and B, it was positively identified by the FBI. Only then would we accept money, because we didn't want to be confused with Geraldo Rivera and his sorry exhibition back in 1986 when he was looking for Al Capone's vault and found nothing more than an empty wine bottle once they got in there. He had sold syndicated shares to his show before he went in. So I said, we're going to stay pure in this thing, man. And the reason why everyone loved us and believed us was because we weren't accepting any money. We turned down money. Listen, we find Hoffa, we're going to ask for the moon and the stars.
Oh, yeah.
But until we find them, until it's positively identified, and I was going to make no claim to the reward. I was going to give all of that to Frank Coppola and his family. But in the midst of this, Frank dies. He had a long-standing respiratory problem, and he died after collapsing. In fact, he and I were at dinner together when he collapsed. And on January 10th, 2020, he went into his girlfriend was there when it happened. I sort of helped carry him to the car. He refused to go to the hospital. He went to finally over the weekend. He went to the hospital, and they put him in a drug-induced coma as part of the protocol to help save his life. But then 2 months later, on March 16, 2020, Frank died without ever regaining consciousness. So I started writing about what was going on, trying to protect my story and to protect Frank. I'm very loyal to Frank. I want to make sure that his family is taken care of. He's got 2 daughters in college. I wanted to make sure that they were well taken care of. And so the FBI reached out to me, and they said, "We're interested. We're very interested right now in what you have going on." And so we started talking. I created a web page for the FBI where I put on videotapes, documents, photographs, timelines, a history of my entire investigation of what was going on. And then I answered all their questions, anything they wanted. I was happy. And this was use it or lose it time, man. This is, this murder was in 1975. Once again, I am Ahab, and this is my white whale. And doggone it, this is it. I'm 72 years old right now. I'll be 73 next month. And this is it. I'm not going to have this moment again. I am going to give up everything now. I want this thing. This is it. And so the FBI got a search warrant for the area. First, they had a meeting. I was invited to a meeting in Newark, star-studded, and where I was like a Vegas lounge act walking around the room talking about the Hoffa case. And then they continued their investigation. In October of 2021, they dropped a search warrant on the area of the alcove. See, the alcove being under the bridge is controlled by the state of New Jersey. The Department of Transportation controls everything on the bridge and under the bridge. So there shouldn't be anything buried there. And so the FBI dropped a search warrant, and they went in and they searched the area. They did no digging, but they did scans. So then, fast forward 2022, we had given I had members of my team had done a GPR, ground penetrating radar, examination of the area. One in last fall, in the fall of 2021, where they detected something, barrels. And it was by one of their GPR people. Then they went back 6 months later with a new GPR technician, a new ground penetrating radar technician who was not told what the first technician found, and on his own found exactly the same spot. Now, when the FBI went back for their second bite of the apple in June of 2022, a few months ago, the FBI wasn't from, and again, I made an issue about this in the New York Times, and I have no regrets. I have nothing but respect for the FBI. They are heroes in this thing, because I was piggybacking on an FBI lead from 1975 when they flipped Ralph Picardo. I wouldn't even be in this game if it wasn't for the FBI flipping Ralph Picardo in November 1975, which led to the grand jury, which led to the FBI's first search of the Moscato Dump in December of 1975. I mean, the FBI deserves so much credit for that, because I have piggybacked on that. All I really want is a generous assist on this for everything that we've done in the meantime. I mean, I brought this case back to life, and I kept it going. Well, the FBI says they found nothing. They said they found nothing at the location, and they did digging. But then I made the inquiry. I said, did you dig where the one spot we gave you that our company did? And it turns out they had not.
Are there plans to dig there then, Dan?
Well, I have just been wasting the past 6-7 months trying to help very tactically and diplomatically, trying to get all the people involved in this thing back together to go down there and look at the spot that we had. That one GPR guy found last fall, or in the fall of 2021, and that another GPR guy from the same company, but not knowing the results of GPR number 1 6 months earlier, came to exactly the same conclusion. It came to the exact same spot. And we were first told we dug there. And so I sent one of our guys down to Moscato's dump, or down to the alcove, and I said, I want film. And we could see, I got film, and you would see where the FBI had really torn up the area. It looked like a strip mining area. And then we went to the one spot that we had given them, it was pristine. They needed, let alone an excavator. They hadn't even stuck a shovel in this area. And I complained about it. I said, guys, what? This is, here's the area. This is the one place we gave you. And they said, we scanned there. And I said, I'm sorry. If you could scan there, you would have come up with the same scans. GPR 1 and GPR 2 came up with 6 months apart from each other. And so we're trying to very diplomatically, because we're dealing with the greatest law enforcement agency in the history of the world. We're trying to get this thing resolved, because I'm on the hook here. I've pushed all my chips in on this thing, and I'm not wrong. He is there. He is there. I don't know if he's in this particular location or another location, but he is in that alcove. There's no way that Picardo did not lie to the FBI in 1975, because he was going to lose his federal witness protection status if he did lie. Phil Moscato did not lie to me in 2007 to 2014 when I was involved, and Frank Coppola's father did not lie to him, and Frank Coppola did not lie to me. Hoffa is there. And so we are just hoping that we can have the opportunity to prove it. Unfortunately, we need the FBI in order to make this happen. And again, we think that the FBI deserves a tremendous amount of credit if this becomes successful. Once again, all the work I've done has piggybacked on a lead that the FBI created in November 1975 when they flipped Ralph Picardo.
If it's not dug up and Jimmy Hoffa is not found, will you ever feel complete?
No, absolutely not. No, I've got, I've been doing this for 48 years. I've been investigating the mob for 49 years, and I have been investigating the Jimmy Hoffa, this 48-year-old murder case for 48 years. I was there from day one. Most of the FBI agents I've been dealing with weren't even born when Hoffa disappeared, and if they were born, they were reading about it in their weekly readers. It is, with all respect to everybody else, I own this case. I'm the one who interviewed Hoffa's killers. I'm the one who interviewed McMaster and all of his goon squad. I'm the one who's interviewed all the critical characters in this case, including Moscato, including Frank Coppola. They got to take that. They got to take that seriously. And once again, no one has even dented my credibility in all of this, except for this conclusion that they went there with all this big equipment and they found nothing. Well, if you had looked in the one place that we gave you, maybe you would have found something. So that's what we're hoping for. We're hoping for, one way or another, we are going to have satisfaction on this. We are going to know one way or the other as to the locations that we're interested in. And so we'll see what happens with this. I have nothing but respect for the FBI, but doggone it, they put me in a real bad position here. And no, I'm not going to rest until this thing is resolved.
I hope soon that I either get an alert on my phone or hear something on the TV that they're going to dig at that exact location where they find Hoffa, you get the white whale. One of the greatest mysteries in American history is resolved, and you get the due credit that you're well-deserved. I mean, 48 years of putting research into this, I tip my cap to you.
Well, I've written 10 books. I mean, I wrote one book on Jimmy Hoffa. I wrote a book on Jimmy Hoffa in 1978. I wrote a book about a contract killing in Ohio of a businessman. A brother put a contract on his brother for control of a $50 million a year family-owned business in 1983. In 1986, I wrote a book called Dark Victory, Ronald Reagan, MCA, and the Mob, about the mafia in Hollywood. In 1989, I wrote a book called Interference: How Organized Crime Influences Professional Football, where I investigated game fixing. I investigated mob influence on organized crime. I predicted that sooner or later the sports gambling would be legalized nationwide and that the National Football League would embrace it. I was on Nightline on September 11th, 1989, making that claim. Warren Welsh, the chief of NFL security, made fun of me. Roxy Roxborough, the top odds maker in the country, said I was crazy. And here we are in 2020 and 2023, and what's happening? Everybody's involved in sports gambling, and the NFL is completely and totally embracing it. I was right on that show. And then I did in 1995, I did a book called The Killing of Robert F. Kennedy, where I concluded that Sirhan did it, and he did it alone. I spent a lot of time with Sirhan and interviewed him at length, and the adventure was so much. It was not so. I tell you up front, Sirhan did it, and the adventure is not so much in the destination, but during the trip to get there. And then in 1996, as you noted, 1997, I published a book with Tom Lang and Phil Van Adder, the two lead detectives of the O.J. Simpson case, called Evidence Dismissed, about the inside story of the police investigation of the O.J. Simpson case. I mean, O.J. was so guilty. It was like dripping with guilt. The prosecution could have screwed up that case up worse than they did, especially when they decided to use Mark Furman as a witness. Mark Furman was horrible, just a horrible, horrible person. And then I did a book called A Washington Tragedy, about the suicide of Vincent Foster, who was Deputy White House Counsel in the Clinton White House. He was Hillary Clinton's former law partner in the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock, one of Bill Clinton's best friends growing up. And once again, there was a lot of conspiracy talk about that, but the evidence is very, very clear that Vince Foster committed suicide. He acted alone. And then I did my memoir called Confessions of a Guerrilla Writer, which I'm very, very proud of, which sort of was a compendium of all these other stories that I've been involved in. And then I did a book called Hollywood Confidential, about the Pelicano wiretapping case, which is going to be becoming part of which was over years ago, but Pelicano ended up doing. He was the sleuth to the stars. If you were a Hollywood celebrity and you were in trouble in a marriage or with the law or something like that, you went to certain attorneys. Certain attorneys would contact Anthony Pelicano, this very talented private investigator, and they went after, and Pelicano would get the job done. He was a notorious wiretapper. And so he was caught, went to jail for, I guess, 15, 16, 17 years. And then I wrote a book about that. There were a lot of books that had been received contracts from big New York publishing houses. None of them came out. The only book that came out about this case was mine, and I had to self-publish it in order to get it out. Once again, it's called Hollywood Confidential. And then I did a book in 2020 on corruption in higher education, focusing on the student loan program and on for-profit colleges, that many of which were scam operations. And so that was no mafia involved in that, but some people who were almost as badass, certainly criminal enterprise. So right now, I'd like to do a book on Hoffa. I'm working on my third book on Hollywood, the mafia in Hollywood. And so I'm still 73. I still got some teeth in my head. I'll be 73 next month. I still have some teeth in my head. I'm still, I still have the fire in my belly. And I'm still ready to go out there and kick some ass.
Listeners, go to the show notes. I'm going to put a link to where you can get to Dan's website, and I'll put a link where you can get connected to his books. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the show, giving us some insight into your investigation, your research onto the Jimmy Hoffa case. I really appreciate it.
Thoughts and prayers, my friend. Thank you, Tommy. Pleasure being with you. Call me anytime.
I will. Listeners, go to the show notes. Make sure you follow me on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. And make sure you're joining the Before the Lights exclusive members group that includes private Zoom calls with former guests, a one-of-a-kind poker chip, some discounts, and you get extra content. Go to beforethelightspod.com/support. There'll also be a link in the show notes for that as well. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.